Good evening. My name is Ellie Meyerfeld. I'm the CEO here at the Holocaust Memorial Center, and I'd like to welcome everyone this evening. Today, January 27, was designated by the United Nations General Assembly as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Since 2005, when that resolution passed, commemoration ceremonies are held around the world to mark the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau and to honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and millions of the other victims of Nazism. Today serves as an official commemoration of all victims of the Nazi regime. Though the term Holocaust refers to the loss of the 6 million Jews, because the Nazis also had other victims, Roma, Sinti, gay men, people with disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, amongst others. Truly, it doesn't just represent a crime against the Jews. The Holocaust represents an assault on humanity. Jews were hated because they were different. For millennia, Jews were the archetypical other, non-Christians in Christian Europe, non-Muslims in Muslim Middle East. In truth, though, we are all other. Each one of us is unique and different. A society that has no sufferance for difference also has no respect for humanity. And a hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. Wherever you find anti-Semitism, there you will also find a threat to liberty. Free association cannot be sustained when buttressed by hate. And that's why I want to especially thank all of our members and dedicated volunteers who have continued to support the museum and its mission over the past very difficult year. I also want to thank our community partners at the Voice Vision Holocaust Survivor Oral History Archive for partnering in this event today and in the earlier event earlier today. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Robert Michaels, President of the Sinai Medical Staff Foundation, one of the sponsors for our new special exhibit, Deadly Medicine, Creating the Master Race, to introduce our program and our guest speaker. Dr. Michaels.
Good evening. I am Robert Michaels. I'm the president of the Sinai Medical Staff Foundation. The foundation is proud to present and be a supporter of the Deadly Medicine and Special exhibit. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Patricia Herber Rice, a senior historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Dr. Herber Rice serves as a specialist on medical crimes and eugenic policies in Nazi Germany. She has a PhD in German and Central European history from the University of Maryland. She is a prolific writer and editor. Dr. Herber Rice is currently co-editing Nazi Sites for Racial Preservation, Detection, Murder, and Resettlement of Non-Jews. I welcome Dr. Patricia Rice. Thank you for allowing our foundation to be present.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michaels. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to the Michigan Holocaust Center. And really, it's a pleasure and an honor to join you here today, this evening, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I've been working at the museum in the Senior Historian's Office for about 25 years. So I've had a good amount of time to talk about Nazi criminality. But if you look at most Nazi crimes, there's a common pattern with those crimes. If you look at them in a judicious light, you'll see that the majority of these crimes were committed by police or parapolice organizations, whether that's the Gestapo on the streets of Germany or German-occupied Europe, whether that's SS guards in the concentration camps and killing centers, or whether it's the Einsatzgruppe in the so-called mobile killing units, moving behind the German lines in the German-occupied Soviet Union, murdering Jews and other civilians in the killing fields of the Soviet Union. But the story is a little different because this is a story about medicine, and specifically about medicine misused, I think we can safely say abused, as state policy under a notorious dictatorship. The history of Nazi crimes and of medicine under Nazism is an understudied chapter of that history that is our mandate at my organization, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, but it's an integral one to help us to understand how that tapestry if anything so dark and ugly can be called tapestry, how those threads of Holocaust ideology and policy, racial policy, come together to become the Holocaust. So this is a very instructive history and a story very much worth telling. We all like to think that Madison is a progressive force, a force for healing, especially in this COVID-19 environment. In common conception, we hope that the ethics that underpin our medical profession are stable and enduring. But as we know, those traditional concepts of medicine's core values were profoundly shaken, profoundly challenged in the 1930s and 1940s when medical professionals began to lend their services to the priorities and policies of the National Socialist dictatorship. Physicians, psychiatrists, nurses, other medical professionals all participated in some of the most terrible crimes associated with the Nazi era. Why is this so? How is this so? How is it that a profession which we routinely trust to protect us and our well-being, and who today we see as those frontline heroes during this COVID pandemic, how could they be involved with such grisly crimes? And some of the answer lies in this. Most of you are aware that during its 12 years in power, the Nazi dictatorship targeted individuals whom its ideology defined as biological enemies, most significantly, of course, Jews, but also notably Roma and Sinti, so-called gypsies, for discrimination, for persecution, and finally, especially in respect to Jews, for systematic destruction. Yet even within what the Nazis would have considered the racial community that they had constructed for themselves, certainly Jews and Roman Sinti are outside that community as far as the Nazis are concerned. There were, if you will, there was an internal enemy, a kind of fifth column in the Nazi way of thinking. And those were individuals they thought who constituted biological and economic danger. The hereditarily ill, today we call those persons with severe mental, physical, and social disabilities who Nazi leaders argued made no significant contribution to their society and whose existence placed a genetic and financial burden on that society and the state. Already in the earliest years of the Nazi regime, Nazi authorities were all about dividing their community into what they thought were its valuable and non-valuable members. And because so much of what it was to be racially valuable, socially valuable in Nazi Germany had genetic or biomedical implications, medical professionals were in this very unique vantage point to help Nazi authorities partition their racial community into its valuable and non-valuable members and devise what I like to call radical public health strategies to help the Nazis achieve some of their aims. And in the short time I have with you this evening, I'd like to discuss two state policies in which medical professionals participated actively. The first, compulsory sterilization, a public state policy instituted in the very early years of the Nazi regime. And second, the so-called Euthanasia Program, a secret and state-sponsored operation that targeted for killing on a massive scale Germany's mentally and physically disabled patients living in institutions. So when I say the word this evening, euthanasia, I want you to see that in sort of scare quotes, because this is not classical euthanasia in terms of what we call assisted suicide or assisted death, which is a part of our biomedical and ethics debates today, but rather this is a cynical program of mass murder. About 250,000 disabled patients with disabilities were murdered during the war years in Nazi Germany, and that's a significant portion of the institutionalized population. This is the first program of Nazi mass murder. It targets mainly German, Aryan patients with disabilities, and it precedes the genocide of European Jewry that we know as the Holocaust by about 2 years. What I won't be discussing in as much detail tonight, because they were not, with a few exceptions, a matter of state policy, is the issue of medical experimentation. But let me say a few words about those experiments, and I welcome your questions about them in the question and answer period. Unethical medical experimentation is a crime that most of us associate with Nazi doctors. Unlike compulsory sterilization, the euthanasia program, these were not matters of state policy and didn't really reference, again, with notable exceptions, didn't reference Nazi racial policy. They were crimes of opportunity for the most part. What one did in order to use concentration camp prisoners for medical experimentation was to petition Heinrich Himmler in his role as Reichsführer SS, and kind of in charge of the concentration camp system, to use these prisoners for medical experimentation. And we used to think, coming from Nuremberg testimony, that the euthanasia program claimed about 70,000 victims, while medical experimentation claimed over 100,000 lives. And because today we have works like that of Paul Weinbein, which came out just a few years ago on medical experimentation, we know that there were probably less than 20,000 prisoners who were unfortunately still too many test subjects in these inhumane and forced medical research. And about 8,000 of those died as a direct result of that experimentation. The bulk of experimentation really aims not so much at Nazi racial policy, but at developing rescue methods or treatment methods for emergency situations that German troops or occupation officials encountered in the field, whether to make seawater potable for German flyers who were downed in the North Atlantic. There were high altitude experiments to determine how high a German bomber could fly without oxygen to avoid, the higher you fly, you understand you're safer from flak, but if you fly too high without oxygen, you can lose consciousness. And also pharmaceuticals to cure, or those all-important vaccines that we're talking about today, then in order to protect soldiers from things like typhus or malaria. So the nature of the experiments were for the most part, although illegitimate in their base, were for practical reasons and not associated with Nazi racial policy, like euthanasia, which was a much more lethal program. So that's why we're emphasizing this program rather than medical experimentation this evening. So how do we get there? How do we get to the murder of 250,000 patients with disabilities? So that this all makes a little bit of sense, I want to preface my talk this evening with points that maybe provide a little bit of context in that area. And the first point of that context is the German medical community itself. German medicine, the 1920s, 1930s, even the 1940s. So during World War II, were really at the forefront of the international medical community. They're ahead in terms of the medical sciences, with winning many of the Nobel Prizes. On the part of German-speaking Europe, I should include here Germany and Austria and Switzerland, along with Germany, in taking Nobel Prizes in medicine and chemistry in these years. Medical research into things like cancer. It was not an American doctor in the 1980s who figures out that secondhand smoke can cause lung cancer. It was a German doctor, a Nazi doctor, so-called, in the 1930s and 40s that found out that secondhand smoke caused lung cancer in non-smokers. In terms of public health, the same thing I've just mentioned about secondhand smoke. Nazi Germany is the first place that I know of anywhere that has smoking bans in some public places. That's something you really don't see here in the United States until the 1990s. So very far ahead in terms of preventive medicine. At a time when we didn't have antibiotics and preventive medicine was or they were just being developed at that point. They come out like penicillin in about right at the end of World War II. So at that time, preventive medicine is all the more important. Unfortunately for German doctors, this was also a community that was very rapidly Nazified. Fascist dictatorships like the Nazis were interested in what they call coordination, bringing professional organizations and associations together with Nazi policy and ideology. And fortunately for the German medical community, they're very quickly Nazified. 45% of doctors are members of the Nazi Party, the highest percentage of party membership per profession. This is not to say that all doctors were Nazi doctors, but what it does demonstrate is there's fertile ground for what I'd like to call aid to these radical public health strategies. And the second part of the puzzle that makes this quandary comprehensible is the advent of eugenics. an international scientific movement of the 19th and late 19th, early 20th centuries. The term means good birth. It's coined by the English scientist Sir Francis Galton in the late 1890s. And at the core of the movement's belief system is the idea that human heredity is fixed and immutable. It's nature, not nurture, that's going to make you a significant, make you a person who gives a significant contribution to society. It's nature, not nurture, who's going to place you on the welfare dole because you've inherited that inability to contribute to society. This was the belief at the time. And the idea in a nutshell is this: if you can breed a better dog or you can breed a better horse, as human beings have been doing for quite a while now, one can breed a better man and a better national body. So eugenics is an international movement, and it has its real heyday right before World War I. So about 1913, that would have been the Kaiser's Germany in those days, where eugenics was so popular. So the Nazis don't invent eugenics, and Great Britain, the United States, and Germany are at the forefront of the international eugenics movement at that time. Everywhere, eugenicists had some ideas that were going to help their particular community. Here in the United States, issues centered around things like immigration, the idea that that comes with the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 that sets quotas, large quotas for Western and Northern Europe, small quotas for Eastern and Southern Europe, with the idea of keeping America white Anglo-Saxon America. But basically, eugenicists had, wherever they were, some kinds of ideas in common. And there are basically four of this. First, they want to decide who's valuable in their society and encourage them to reproduce and support them in reproduction. Second, they want to define who's not valuable and marginalize those individuals, discourage them from reproducing if necessary by sterilization, and that's right where we're headed. Third, they want to divert human and material resources from the unworthy to the valuable. And that's the reverse of Judeo-Christian charity, isn't it? And the idea of the welfare state. You don't, the idea of a welfare state or charity is to give to the needy and the vulnerable. And that's wrong-headed, eugenicists say. We want to give our vital resources to people who are already contributing to society. So that's a break in the kind of traditional thinking about charity and welfare. And fourth, you want to keep the races from intermarrying. We had anti-miscegenation laws in this country that are booted up and shored up by eugenic measures in the 1920s and 30s. And if you think back to the Nuremberg laws of 1935, those fundamental laws that provide the basis for future anti-Semitic legislation in Germany. One of those laws specifically forbids German Jews from marrying so-called German Aryans or non-Jews, or for having sexual liaisons with them. And if you think about that, yes, absolutely, that's an anti-Semitic act. There's no question about that. But it's also a eugenic idea, and it's that kind of culmination of the virulent racial anti-Semitism the Nazis bring with them when they come to power, combined with a radical interpretation of eugenics that makes Nazi racial theory such a lethal cocktail. And since we associate the Nazis with selective breeding, and since we know that Nazi authorities, many of them, including Hitler, whom we see here and showing himself as the doctor of the German people, which is a kind of scary thought if you think about it. The Nazis, when they come to power, they have the will, they have the volition to put these ideas into very concrete and radical terms. One of the first things they do in this area is a compulsory sterilization law, which is put into effect very early on, a bare 6 months after the Nazis come to power. The law for the prevention of progeny with hereditary diseases, it's promulgated on the 14th of July, 1933, after Hitler comes to power, and it orders the forcible sterilization of persons with certain afflictions. And here you see the 9 disabilities, disorders, or diseases that are outlined in the law. If you look at them closely, 5 of those diseases specifically designated represent psychiatric or neurological disorders, including schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, today bipolar disorder, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, a rare degenerative and extremely hereditary disease, and hereditary feeble-mindedness, which today encompasses not only persons with severe intellectual disabilities, but also individuals who were deemed outside of the mores of German society. And I'll get back to that in just a moment. There are some physical conditions that warrant sterilization under this new law: hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, serious physical deformity that comes from an hereditary agent, and severe alcoholism, which is seen by some scientists then as today as having a genetic component. So now medical professionals are duty bound to report patients with these disorders in their practice. And once a proposal goes forward to sterilize an individual, the suit comes before an hereditary health court. And here you see in a very grainy photo, I'm sorry for the quality of the photo here, but we have very, very few of these hereditary health courts. There are about 250 hereditary health courts established in Germany throughout 1936. They're a Nazi invention superimposed on the German legal system. And these hereditary health courts are usually attached to the local district court, but what makes them different is their content. And something I have to kind of footnote, Germany, unlike us before 1945, did not have a jury system. So if you committed a crime, you would be judged by a jury member, a judge, or a number of panelists on a juridical tribunal like these. And what makes this so different is that on these tribunals for hereditary health courts, they include 3 members, 1 jurist, so 1 trained professional judge, and 2 medical professionals, usually psychiatrists, which means that the bulk of decision-making is actually made by the physicians on that hereditary health court. And so if a patient is judged for sterilization, they have to go to have the procedure carried out within 2 weeks' time at a local hospital or clinic. A paragraph of the law allows the use of force on unwilling victims. So those who attempted to circumvent this procedure were delivered under police guard to the hospital or clinic that's designated in the verdict. And this new law takes effect in January 1934. And the most careful study of data that we have suggests that from January 1934 until war's end in 1945, some 400,000 Germans were forcibly sterilized under the terms of the sterilization law. This figure does not include the thousands of Jews, Gypsies, Poles, and other victims sterilized extra-legally in the concentration camp during the war years. And this segment of medical experimentation in which these persons were sterilized is indeed one of the exceptions to the rule that I just spoke about as being experimentation that is not linked to Nazi ideology. This is the one really glaring exception of that. And I can clarify that more in the question and answer period when we have time. So who are the victims of sterilization policy? Obviously, there are those who suffer from the conditions outlined in the law, with a clear preponderance for those who suffer from mental rather than physical disabilities. And nowhere is this more true than in the case of this hereditary feeble-mindedness, whose ambiguous definition permits physicians and psychiatrists to include not only those who are diagnosed as intellectually disabled, learning impaired, with some kind of developmental disability, but also, as I said earlier, those who are outside the mores of German society, the socially aberrant, if you will, as they would have been termed in those days, asocials, vagrants, truants, homeless people, prostitutes, sexually promiscuous women, especially if they were poor and had more than one illegitimate child and were on welfare. Petty criminals, juvenile delinquents who have trouble with school authorities and the police, and in very large numbers, per their representation in German society, Roma and Sinti, so-called gypsies, sterilized in large numbers in comparison to their relatively small representation in the German population during the 1930s and the war years. So legalized sterilization then proves some of the opening salvo, if you will, in the attack upon Germany's mentally and physically disabled, which continues throughout the first decade of the Nazi dictatorship. But as war ends, as war nears, it's been a long day, as war nears and racial and territorial policies began to radicalize. A racial policy radicalizing in what historians usually note the sea change happening with Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, that pogrom, that nationwide pogrom against Germany's Jews in November of 1938, when sort of legislated anti-Semitism proceeds to extra-legal terror and finally deportation of German Jews. And as territorial policy begins to radicalize, and as Germany goes to war in September of 1939, voices within the German medical community begin to call for not only the subjugation or the marginalization of these hereditarily ill individuals, as the Nazis termed them, not only sterilizing them, not only marginalizing, but calls for their elimination from society, noting that this is a nation that is going to war and is already burdened both genetically and financially by these individuals. And thus begins the so-called Euthanasia Program, with the Nazis, as I said, the Nazis' first campaign of mass murder, preceding the Shoah, the Holocaust, by about 2 years. And in the spring months of 1939, this man, a number of planners, including this man, Philip Buhler, he was the head of Hitler's chancellery, his private chancellery, the so-called Führer chancellery. He and his team headed Hitler's, or sort of managed Hitler's private affairs as Führer. And it's this small party office off the radar screens of most of the German population, and a perfect little engine to drive a secret killing operation like the Euthanasia Program. So this man, Philip Brandt, and then Philip Buhler, and this man, Karl Brandt, standing where he richly deserved to be in the dock as the chief defendant at the Nuremberg doctor's trial in 1946, is Karl Brandt. He was Hitler's attending physician at the time. The two of these men come together and they begin to organize a secret killing operation in the spring months of 1939, targeting disabled children. On August 18th, 1939, about 2 weeks before Germany invades Poland, the Reich Interior Ministry circulates a decree, and that is the Reich Interior Ministry. That means that you must follow their decree. And it compels all physicians and midwives. I want you to think about this time, 1930s, 1940s, when most Germans would have been, and most Americans too probably, born in their homes with midwives rather than at the hospital. So doctors and midwives are supposed to now, they're duty bound by price of fine or imprisonment to report newborns and children under the age of 3 whom they see with signs of severe mental or physical disability. And once aware that, that these children are living, the public health authorities reach out to the parents of these children. They're in a kind of a tricky situation because most children before the age of 3, unless they're very severely disabled, tend to live with their parents. It tends to be about school age when there's mandatory schooling in Germany in 1940s, 1939, 1940s. And it's at that time that children are usually institutionalized because they would have had to, they were obligated in some way to get schooling for the child if it was educable. The child was educable. So they had to avail themselves. There was no mainstreaming as there is today. So these mental institutions in those days would have provided that schooling. So it's really hard to get children. Most children under the age of 3 are still living with their parents when they're disabled. So how to get them away and to get them into this murder program. And so euthanasia operatives use a kind of carrot and stick approach with the parents of these children. They say, listen, we have these special pediatric units. Be careful when the Nazis say anything using the word special, right? Special treatment means murder, right? And special pediatrics facilities were no exception. We have these special pediatric institutions that are going to offer the best wonderful new developments, new technologies, new treatments, new therapies for your disabled child. Why don't you avail yourself of these facilities and give your child to one of these institutions? And for those parents, when this becomes an open secret, the euthanasia program, child euthanasia and adult euthanasia, and parents are reluctant to give up their children, then the operatives use the stick. Oh, you don't have the best, you don't have the best intentions for your child in order to avail yourself to these opportunities that these facilities provide. You don't have the best of interest of your child at heart. We might have to consider taking the child from parental custody. And so with this carrot and stick approach, parents begin to hand over their children to the child euthanasia program. Once this happened, children arrive at these special pediatric units. They are in reality children's killing wards after a period of observation to make sure that the child, that the parents aren't immediately surprised that the child has died. The child is murdered, usually after about 3 or 4 months. The child is murdered by overdoses of medication, sometimes by starvation. At first, only infants and toddlers were incorporated in this effort according to the strictures of the law, but the scope does eventually widen to juveniles under the age of 18. Conservative estimates now put, and I think these are still conservative estimates, estimate that about 10,000 mainly German children die as a result of the child euthanasia program at one of 31 specially designated children's killing wards through starvation or lethal overdoses of medication. And by January of 1940, an adult killing operation parallels the murder of disabled German infants and toddlers. And codenamed Operation T4, there you see that villa. This unit takes its code name from the street address of its sort of nerve center in the center of Berlin. This villa that you see here was a Jewish-owned villa that was Aryanized. It was taken away from its Jewish owners, and it serves really as the nerve center for the T4 operation, for this vast coordination effort to bring patients to killing centers, to murder them. And its street address is Tiergartenstrasse 4. So T4 becomes the code name for this operation. And utilizing a practice developed for the child euthanasia program, T4 planners began in the autumn of 1939, just as child euthanasia program is beginning, they begin to circulate these carefully formulated questionnaires to public health officials, public and private hospitals, nursing homes for the chronically ill and aged. And if you can see one of these forms, thank you very much. You'll notice, well, you can't if you can't read German, but the sinister purpose of the form was the emphasis that was placed on the patient's capacity to work, and also by the categories of patients that are public health authorities and clinic directors are required to identify. Those suffering from serious disability of some kind, mental or physical, those not of German or related blood, quote unquote. Read here, Jews. The dirty little secret of the euthanasia program is that 5,000 Jews are murdered, mainly in the summer months of 1940, before the general deportation of German Jews begins in October of 1941. Also, these medical directors have to register for this program, for the possibility of being a candidate for this program. The criminally insane, persons who've committed crimes under diminished capacity and are serving their sentence in a mental health facility rather than prison. And finally, persons who had been at this particular facility for more than 5 years. They're looking for long-term, chronic, incurable patients. And so these registration forms are then viewed by a team of medical experts, specifically recruited physicians and psychiatrists to look at these forms. They're usually not seeing the patients involved and who are recruited, as I said, for the secret program, and reviewing these registration forms beginning in January 1940. Those persons who are selected for the euthanasia program and confirmed through a central medical commission in Berlin are transported to one of 6 killing centers throughout Germany and Austria. And you see them here, Brandenburg and the Havel near Berlin, Grafeneck in the Swabian Alb in southwestern Germany, Bernburg and Sonnenstein, both in Saxony in eastern Germany, Hartheim near Linz on the Danube, what was then in annexed Austria, and Hadamar, the most famous of these sites, right around near Frankfurt in this, what is today the state of Hessen. And within hours of arrival at such a facility, patients selected for gassing are gassed in specially designed gas chambers. Their dental gold is removed and they're cremated in special crematory ovens. This sounds familiar to you? Of course it should, because most historians agree that although that was not the intent at the time, the euthanasia program does serve sort of as a dry run for that more systematic mass murder program that's called the Final Solution, the genocide of European Jewry. So much of the specific gassing technology, the specific crematory technology that's used in this program. There was crematory technology before this, but the specific crematory technology that's used, the camouflage techniques that are used to lure patients into a false sense of security at the very door of the gas chamber, are refined upon, elaborated upon to be used by the planners of the Final Solution when they decide to murder Jews in stationary gas chambers in German-occupied Poland. And so that's one of the first vital links between this first murder program and the more comprehensive genocide of European Jewry that we're commemorating here tonight. This program was a secret one, and there were elaborate efforts undertaken to conceal its deadly designs. Official records are falsified. The families of the victims receive urns filled with the ashes of the cremated, not necessarily the ashes of their loved ones, but they're told that they are, even though in every case official records are falsified to indicate that the victims have died from natural causes. The euthanasia program quickly becomes an open secret. And so, fearing public unrest at a very critical point in the war, Germany has just invaded the Soviet Union. Adolf Hitler himself gives orders to halt the T4 program in late August, the 24th of August, 1941. According to T4's own internal statistics, 70,273 institutionalized mentally and physically disabled persons perished at these 6 euthanasia facilities between January 1940 and August of 1941. Yet Hitler's order for the termination of this program doesn't mean an end to the killing. The child euthanasia program goes on as before, but more significantly, we know that the following summer, so this pause lasts roughly from August 1941 until roughly August of 1942. And in the summer of 1942, there's a drive to reinitiate the adult euthanasia program. And that crystallizes again, as I said, in the summer of 1942, the second murder phase. And it's here too, in this particular pause, that there is a final vital link between the T4 program and the Final Solution, the genocide of European Jewry. Because as they wait, as the personnel who wait, they're waiting, they're sort of sitting on their hands waiting for the planners of euthanasia to kind of knock out the kinks, make it more covert, what to do with these hundreds of personnel waiting to figure out what's going to happen next, essentially sitting on their hands. Well, the planners of the final solution have a plan for that too. And in the late winter months, early spring months of 1941, about 100 male operatives, one male doctor, several male nurses, as well as crematory personnel and administrators go from the T4 operation to the camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, known as the Operation Reinhardt camps. Those are killing centers for Jews, mainly for Jews. 1.7 million Jews in the general government, the German-occupied Poland, are murdered as a result of Operation Reinhardt in these three camps. The largest of those killing centers, Treblinka, the end station of the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. 925,000 Jews are killed at Treblinka. That's almost as many as at Auschwitz. And who's doing the bulk of the killing? Who represents most of the German staff in this particular time period? They are T4 operatives who've been transferred there. What are they doing there? They have proven themselves inured to killing vulnerable patients on their home soil, defenseless, innocent victims. They are used to the specific gassing technology that's used in the T4 operations, and it expanded at Operation Reinhardt, these three camps. They are used to the crematory technology that's been expanded, and they've shown themselves politically reliable for a secret murder operation on German soil involving German civilians. So they're going to be reliable in this operation as well. And that is the final link between Operation T4, the Euthanasia Program, and the final solution. So, but what happens when the Euthanasia Program is revived in the summer of 1942? You see here the Kaufbeuren Institution, one of many euthanasia facilities that operated between 1942 and 1945 in the second killing phase. This is a more decentralized phase than the original gassing phase. It's still carefully choreographed in Berlin, but here the local staff, the local T4 operatives, the euthanasia operatives at each euthanasia facility are controlling the pace of the killing. They're deciding who dies, and they're kind of slowing down the process. So instead of gassing 80 persons who may show up every day for gassing, as happened at the 6 killing facilities, instead they are maybe choosing 20 patients a day to be murdered. There are some other changes too. They're using the more successful modes of killing that are used in child euthanasia, overdoses of medication, and sometimes starvation, particularly in Bavaria, where Kaufbeuren was particularly popular mode of killing for the euthanasia program, to use starvation. Second, the personnel who kill changes in this second killing phase. The euthanasia program had a motto that the gas valve belongs in the hands of the physician. The physicians carried out the gassing, which medicalizes the killing process. But here it's the nurses, it's the male and female nursing staff who are now killing on the evening shift, because that looks more natural, doesn't it? To have sedatives administered during the evening shift for patients that may be agitated so that they can get some rest. And I think what's interesting here is that it's this point in the history of the Holocaust writ large that females, perpetrators, enter really into the killing process. Yes, there are guards at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, female guards, but it's here that women are really killing alongside men. And finally, it's decentralized. So instead of having those 6 gassing facilities that we saw in the earlier map, it's now almost 100 institutions throughout Germany and Austria. In all, as I said, 250,000 patients are murdered in respect of the Operation T4 or the euthanasia program. And I think what's always interested me so much in this particular program, this particular operation, is, and you're looking at this photograph, or we were looking at the photograph of Kaufbeuren a moment ago, and it is exactly, to a certain extent, what it seems to be from the outside. It is a facility that takes in fresh patients from the local neighborhood, as well as those patients who are sent for Operation T4. It tends to the patients as best they could in this particular circumstances in the time before there were antipsychotic drugs, and they also release patients who get better. But at the same time, in the same wards, the same staff that are taking care of these patients are also murdering patients on the evening shift at places like Kaufbeuren. And for me, it's that juxtaposition of healing and killing that I find so fascinating, and it continues to fascinate me to this day. I'll stop here, and I'm very eager to hear your questions and to have a discussion with you all. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Bryce, that was really great. This is a fascinating topic, which is horrific at the same time as just so challenging to our pre-imagined positions about medical ethics. So I'm just going to share some of the questions that were asked. Two of them that I'm going to ask together. Paul asked when Americans and Europeans became aware of the euthanasia and the forced sterilizations. And the other question I wanted to ask at the same time is, were there parallels? You mentioned how eugenics was actually a worldwide theory. Were there parallels in the United States or elsewhere in the world at the early stages? Obviously, I wouldn't imagine T4 itself, but of the early stages of these programs.
Right. So those are really good questions. So I'll take the first one. So I'll take them as they came. So when is there awareness of this? Well, for forced sterilization, of course, and that actually feeds into the second question that our viewers asked, is a forced sterilization. This was common knowledge. This was a public program of sterilization. And of course, as I'm about to say, and maybe I should just say that now, where there are parallels, and answer that part as well, is that, of course, the United States had an experience with sterilization as well. We're trying to keep this a short program in the confines of an hour. I could talk for hours about this. So I did not mention, but I'm glad to have the opportunity to do so now, that we did have sterilization in this country as well. The first sterilization law of any kind that I know of, compulsory sterilization, was in 1907 in the state of Indiana. And by the late 1930s, about half of American states have sterilization laws of some kind, including here in the great state of Virginia, where I happen to be sitting, and which has the second highest sterilization rate in the country. The first highest rate of sterilization per capita was the state of California, and it is actually the California state law provides the template for the centralized Nazi law, the compulsory sterilization law that I've been talking about this evening. So of course, there was clear understanding and pride among American eugenicists that the Germans had kind of followed them in this direction and were proceeding on a much more radical scale. Here in the United States, we think that about 60,000, so 50 to 70,000 individuals were sterilized between 1907 and the 1950s as these laws began to come off the books. Many of them, the North Carolina state law stays on until 2003, stunningly, but they began to fall off in the 1950s. But the Germans sterilized within a much shorter time frame, within basically a decade. They sterilized 400,000 individuals. So this was something that Americans were keenly aware of, and they thought, that's great, they're taking our example and running with it. So there are some parallels there. There aren't the parallels for the Euthanasia Program. As I said earlier, there was awareness through the grapevine for doctors, an awareness of some kind of malevolent activity going on.
My light went off.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Nope. Something, an obvious perception that there was something going on in the way of killing in these institutions in Germany. We know that the first article to come out in the international press was in Reader's Digest in 1943 by William Shirer. We're all familiar with his Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, a popular book on the Nazis. But Shirer was in contact with a number of German reporters in the 1940s after he'd been sent from Berlin after the Americans joined the war. And he was on this basis of their reports, leaked reports, able to report some idea of what happened in the euthanasia program. So I find that all very interesting. 1943 is the earliest that we know of reports coming to an American audience.
And were those journalists looking to leak this information outside?
Yes. There's a fascinating article, I forget the author, that appeared or will appear shortly in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the journal affiliated with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum that's publishing this. And yes, and so apparently it was actually, if I remember correctly, a woman, a female reporter who leaked this information to Shirer. She had good connections with him while he was in Berlin.
So that's journalism. Was there any evidence? Irvin asked if there was any evidence of organized opposition from German medical professionals, medical organizations, and another asked about clergy.
Right. So yes, on all of those fronts, surprisingly, relatively little resistance concerning the sterilization program, which of course was a public program. As expected, those protests would have come from clergy and from medical professionals within the Catholic community, because as today, sterilization is one of those things that goes against Catholic doctrine. And we have large numbers of, because the word sister, or the German word for nurse, is Krankenschwester, and reflects that birth. The nursing orders, especially in Europe, came from religious orders, from nuns originally. And so there were still very many nursing nuns who were nursing professionals as well, who tried to resist what they could do. They could refuse to take part in a sterilization proceeding, but what they had to do was provide someone else who would replace them in that procedure. So they literally had to find a body to replace them in the operating room. There was a certain amount of resistance, and we know the most famous resistance comes from the German clergy in the person of Clemens, the Bishop von Galen. He was the Bishop of Münster at the time. In the post-war, he's the first German cleric to be made a cardinal right after World War II. And famously, he denounces the euthanasia program. He's heard through the grapevine that parishioners from his facility, from a parochial facility in his diocese, had gone to Hadamar and been murdered there. And in August 3rd, 1941, he actually denounces the euthanasia program from his pulpit. And we used to think that this was the reason that Hitler calls a halt to the euthanasia program. It's the nail in the coffin, though. It really is. It's a whole bunch of things going on at the same time and wider public awareness. But the fact that a bishop denounces it from a pulpit, and that his homily, the traditional reading, his sermon basically, is read in Catholic churches the next week all around Germany, indicates the degree of public awareness. And certainly it's the nail in the coffin. The call makes Hitler, kind of forces his hand to call that temporary halt in 1941. Other resistance is not outward resistance. It's more people calling up the line, writing to their people they know in the Nazi party saying, does the Fuhrer know that this is going on? I bet it's that guy Himmler making trouble again. And so what we see as far as other resistance are people trying to get through the network, trying to figure out what's going on. And a lot of clergy say afterwards that they're sorry that, they made private inquiries, but did not speak as Galen did from his pulpit. There are people who also refuse to take part. And nothing happens to these individuals. That's the other dirty secret of the Holocaust, that as many people who say no, they're able to get away with it with nothing happening to them because the leadership knows that there's another person behind them that will say yes and is willing to take their place. And so there are no significant repercussions for refusing to participate in either of these programs, and especially in euthanasia.
Wow. And we have time for one more question. Our own Guy Stern asks, if there was ever a precedent for this euthanasia, we talked quite a bit about the precedents for sterilization. How about for the euthanasia program?
Right. It's sort of the same precedent. It's the eugenics, but the precedent here is really there is quiet, illegal or extra legal child euthanasia that happened, everywhere in the United States and Germany before the Second World War. For example, a child is born with spina bifida, and they might not say something to the parents, and they just simply don't do a procedure for the child to thrive. The child dies immediately, or they give him. This was something that was done not commonly, but not uncommonly all around. And this is the real basis for some of the advocates for child euthanasia. This was something that actually came up in the 1920s in a famous book that's put together that's kind of precedent for the discussion of euthanasia as a possible public health policy, but it was so roundly criticized in Weimar Germany. And it's clear that Hitler understood that it would not be possible to make this public program in Nazi Germany either. But it's clear that there were medical professionals who thought, there's certain babies that are born, with so much of an inability to thrive that we could quietly put them away, put them to sleep. And so that's sort of a basis, but obviously this is actually a systematic program to do so, and with adults in the same circumstance, and with a built-in extra legal protection for those people who are the perpetrators of this. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
It does. And it shows the slippery slope. I mean, I think that's really the danger here. And even though we're out of time, I don't know that you can summarize in literally a minute, the doctors' trials in Nuremberg, and generally what kind of justice those medical professionals who participated, what did they face after the war?
Right. So very little. The doctor's trial focuses mainly, even though the chief defendant is Karl Brandt, who runs the euthanasia program, so many of those individuals are people who were perpetrators of medical experimentation. And the reason for part of this is the decision of the Allies to allow German on German crimes, right? They're Germans killing Germans. And there is no precedent in international law for Germans there's no precedent for the Allies to try Germans for killing their fellow nationals. And so these trials are left to German courts, newly constructed East and West German courts. And the first few years, they're pretty tough sentences, but taking their cues in 1948, when you really have a lot of even American occupation authorities clemencing these individuals, giving shorter sentences to really people with really dirty hands. The Germans follow suit and give very light sentences. There's a euthanasia nurse at Kaufbeuren, which we showed in the photograph. She killed hundreds of people with her own hand. She got 4 years, served half of it for good behavior, basically, and went back to nursing and got a pension in the 1960s. So very little justice.
Wow, that's very difficult. Okay, Dr. Heber Rice, I really appreciate your time here this evening. This has been a really insightful and interesting talk, and we're most appreciative for your time and your efforts to make sure these stories get told.
It's my pleasure. I'm very happy to be here. Happy to be with you all tonight.
Thank you. So I want to again thank our supporters for making the evening possible. Thank Voice Vision for their participation. I want to invite everyone to visit here at the museum. We're open with restrictions. You can make your reservations online to see our new special exhibit, Deadly Medicine, Creating the Master Race, that's produced by the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which examines how the Nazi leadership, in collaboration with individuals who were charged with healing, as we've just heard, using science to legitimize persecution, murder, and then ultimately genocide. And to make it clear that this is not just a history lesson, I want to invite you all on February 11th to join us for our next event regarding the Uyghurs in China. If you visit our homepage at holocaustcenter.org, you'll be able to sign up for that program on February 11th. I encourage everyone to learn about this genocide in advance of the program as well. This is an ongoing outrage, and it speaks to the core of our mission, teaching the lessons of the Holocaust, why each of us has to respect and stand up for the rights of others if we're going to prevent future genocide and hate crimes. But this is not a future genocide. This is a present one. You should contact your senators, your congressperson, you should get engaged and join us on February 11th. Thank you all and good evening.